Okay, the hand dryer's finished. Welcome to our office. This is just a short introduction for people watching on YouTube alone. You won't hear this on the audio version of it. And it's just to address a couple of things. The first one, microphones. We have some new equipment, as you will have noticed from Seb's unruly breathing, which I will stress is nothing to do with Seb and is everything to do with my inability to understand how things work. I think it should be better this week. We've tried a few different things, run a few tests. Look, we were going to do that last week, but there were so many technical problems prior to the recording that we didn't have time, so we just started with what I thought would be fine, but it wasn't. So apologies for that. We'll try to improve that. Yes, the cameras are different. That's funny, isn't it? Alex looks amazing because of my very expensive quality camera. Seb looks pretty ill because of the very poor quality, inexpensive camera that we purchased that we probably shouldn't have. And I look in the middle because I'm using a popular brand of smartphone, which, you know what? They're pretty good, aren't they?
Other smartphone brands are available.
They are. Yeah. No, didn't even say which one it was. It's an iPhone. But it looks fine. And it's from 2012. And it looks better than Seb's camera. The other thing is, and maybe I should say this at the beginning of the actual podcast, because I will do that. Okay. Thanks for watching. Hello, and welcome to the Tifo Football Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Devine, and I'm joined today by Seb Stafford-Bloor.
Hello, Joe.
Hello. Come closer, a little bit closer.
I'm afraid of all the breathing thing.
You're afraid of the breathing. We've been over it. Yeah,
I was chasing by all the comments.
It was my fault. It's nothing to do with Seb's breathing. In fact, Seb's the only non-smoker in the room.
Yeah.
So, oddly enough, his breathing should be...
I should not sound like Darth Vader.
No, it should be much better. And Alex Stewart.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Your hair betrays the state of your weekend.
Yeah, lovely.
Enough said.
Anyway, I don't like to start podcasts with anything other than we're beginning, but many people have mentioned Spotify to us, and I just want to take this opportunity at the beginning where most people will hear it to say yes. Unfortunately, it's not that straightforward. Some of you will know that we host our podcasts with SoundCloud, who are currently, I believe, maybe the only podcast host service in the world that doesn't have straight into Spotify. So we are in the process of discussing it with them, also talking about moving somewhere else. We have submitted the feed ourselves to Spotify. It doesn't really work like that anyway, so there's nothing we can do about it right now. But we are doing something about it, and we recognise that people, love Spotify. And why wouldn't they? It's a wonderful service. Okay.
Was that your bid to have our link approved for coffee?
No, just saying, if you see the link and you happen to work for Spotify, please, you would be saving me a lot of time and stress.
Podcast.
It's a popular podcast. It's a really popular podcast. And we're a small team. I don't want to carry on for this too long. I think sometimes people get a different impression because our output is so professional, guys. But we really are a small team. And last week when we did the podcast, said technical issues caused me to have a 15-hour long day, which I don't want to have ever again. So, we respond to things as quickly as we can. Yes, Spotify is high up on the priority list. Anyway, that's boring. What's not boring is Leicester City Football Club. And that's the team that we will be discussing today. It feels like an apt time to be talking about them. Brendan Rodgers is now the new manager, which is something that I think we can discuss with interest. It's an unusual one. Claude Puel, of course, we can discuss his departure. There's a little bit of financial fair play stuff we're going to talk about, not in depth, it's just interesting. There's a lot of young players at the club we're going to discuss as well. And I think the main theme for the show, and for Leicester generally at the moment, is discussing, as Seb said to me before the podcast, the idea of what success is for Leicester, because obviously 2015-16 was a modern fairy tale, really. I mean, it sounds kind of a cliche to describe it in that way, but it's still funny to think about now. So we'll have a think about that as well. But let's begin with Brendan Rodgers and Claude Puel. Seb, in your estimation, I mean, it's a difficult one whether it was right or not to lose Puel. He didn't necessarily do anything obviously wrong. Results weren't terrible. And as well, we'll come on to talking about this a little bit more, but Brendan Rodgers is an odd appointment given the way that we know, or the style of play that Leicester have become synonymous with, which is very, very different to the style of play which Brendan Rodgers is infamous for. What was the problem with Claude Puel for you?
I don't think it was any one individual problem. I think it was kind of a confluence of issues. Maybe first and foremost, his personality is difficult. We sort of exist in a football culture where managers are personalities and characters, and Puel is a very quiet man. I mean, his press conferences are almost they're almost parodies. He's so quiet that quite literally, if you don't sit in the first, second, or third row of the press conference itself, you can't hear what he's saying. But obviously, the results were very mixed. This season specifically, he didn't take the domestic cups seriously enough. They lost on penalties to Manchester City in the League Cup. Anyone can do that. But he played a weakened side. I saw them at Wolves, and he played a weakened side there. They went out to Newport, which is not a good look for a Premier League team. And so for a club that, like anybody else in their position, should really be targeting domestic cup competitions, it's quite dispiriting for the fans. If you know you're not going to finish in the top four, and then you not throw the domestic cups, but if you deprioritize them, that's quite antagonistic, and it's antagonistic to a lot of the more traditional fans who enjoy that.
Well, they were unlikely to be relegated.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
and we know that. I mean, I suppose it's worth pointing out that the higher up the league you finish, the more you make from the broadcasting income. But is it? Yeah, I don't know.
Is it worth throwing away the chance at a trophy run for the sake of 3 extra positions and probably about £5 million?
Given that the loser of the Premier League, I think, earns over 100 million now.
Yeah, I mean, it's an argument which needs context. Of course, it does, but in my opinion, no. But Puel, Leicester, I've watched them a few times this season in person, and the thing I took from all of those games was they are just, you cannot form a single opinion about them, or at least you couldn't under Puel, because minute to minute, you could be watching a team who were either very impressive, who played some very neat, stylish football, a side who could not get through half without shooting themselves in the foot with a defensive error, or one of his baffling selections. I think Puel made a rod for his own back with the Vardy situation. I mean, Vardy's on record as saying that he found Puel's style of play, sort of a tactical approach, difficult to adjust to, and because of what Jamie Vardy's linked to. I mean, he is obviously one of the tenets of the championship win. If you alienate him, it's not quite Ruud Gullit and Alan Shearer, but it's not a million miles away from it. And that's a PR end goal. It was for a long time for Puel. And it felt like, I think it's felt inevitable from the moment they lost to Newport County. I think it's very hard to survive that kind of result.
Can I ask about Puel specifically and his personality? Because there's been a lot of discussion about him, not just at Leicester, but previously at Southampton as well. He's not very charismatic, and that's something that comes across rather blatantly. You mentioned already that if you're in a press conference, if you're not that close to the front, you can't even really hear him. Yeah. Do you believe in the modern day Premier League, or it's expanded to European football at the top level? Is it required? Is it a part of the manager's job to be able to, if not be super charismatic, at least avoid getting in a position where your inability to communicate in a way that invigorates the press or your players becomes the story as opposed to anything else?
Yeah, I think it is, but I would refine that a little bit. I think what's important is that a manager has an identity. This is an age of ideologues. Managers have to stand for something, at least if they're to earn a place in the kind of the discussion which surrounds the game, then they have to belong to a specific church in the kind of the tactical sense. I think one of Puel's problems is a PR issue in the sense that you don't really know what he is or what he represents. I mean, depending on how much you're willing to read and research, for instance, that he's had a lot of success with young players, which is presumably why he was appointed by Leicester in the first place. They have a glut of very talented young players, which they've added to since he arrived. Mm-hmm. But Puel is almost he as a result of this kind of quiet persona, and let's remember when he talks, he's talking a second language, so you always have to remember that and always have to forgive that. Not forgive is the wrong word, but you understand what I mean. You have to take that into account. Yeah. But I think what is he as a manager? It's because of how he presents himself, and because he isn't he isn't a figure of any great bombast. He doesn't have a lot of charisma. He doesn't say controversial things in front of the media. He's almost a hollow man. And for a lot of fans, compared with the kind of personalities that dominate other clubs, and which those clubs kind of cluster around, the strong personality at a football club becomes the football club itself. They become interchangeable, and that hasn't been the case with Puel at Leicester or at Southampton, which Alex is a Southampton fan, so maybe he's the better place to answer that.
Yeah, I remember when Puel was signed by Southampton from Nice, and he brought with him Jeremy Pié, who was a sort of utility right back, right midfielder, who was a player of a reasonable quality. But a friend of mine, Arnaud, who's French, who followed Liga very thoroughly, said that one of the reasons that Puel brought someone like Pié across was not just because he knew him as a player, but because Pié was kind of the mouthpiece for Puel in the Nice dressing room. And obviously, I take your language point, but in France, that's not going to be a problem. It was felt that he needed somebody in the dressing room to be his guy, to put forward his ideas, to advocate for him, to kind of almost be his personality within that context. And I think if Leicester are a team, and I think this is probably less the case at Southampton, but Leicester is a team with strong personalities. People like Vardy, Schmeichel, Wes Morgan. These are not just long-standing professionals, but in many instances, professionals who've kind of had to make their own way a lot. They've not had, particularly someone like Vardy or Morgan, has not had success handed to them. And there was a sense when Leicester won the league title that Ranieri was kind of greasing the wheels, but a lot of, not necessarily the decision making, but the kind of mentality of the squad was generated within the squad and not necessarily by Ranieri. And part of what Ranieri brought to that was a kind of laissez-faire attitude of, well, you guys, I trust you to get on with it. If a squad is set up like that with those sorts of personalities in it, and then you get, like Seb says, the hollow man coming in, then there's going to be an issue there, because a hollow man is not a kind of an avuncular, encouraging figure. It can come across as dour, it can come across as almost at times disinterested. And I say this as a Southampton fan who had Puel managing them and was quite encouraged by that appointment for reasons that Seb mentioned. There is a strong track record of development of youth players, for example, and I thought this might work well, but actually, there just never felt to be that kind of connection, that engagement that I think you need between a manager and a squad, and a manager and fans, and a manager and the identity of the club. And I don't think he quite brought that ever.
What are Claude Puel's ideas, Alex? Because you mentioned the idea of him needing a man in the dressing room to convey those. But as Seb said before, it's been difficult at times to really interpret what that was.
Yeah, and it's a question that I struggle to answer even now.
Yeah.
I certainly at Southampton he was partly brought in to add defensive solidity, which he did. I think we had in that season a record of 8 0-0 draws in that season, which was league leading in a bad way. I think there's also, when he was at Nice, he played a fairly attractive 4-3-3. But then at Southampton and again at Leicester, it was much cagier, much more defensive, and I kind of felt like, I want to go out and shoot the builders.
This is Weeks, by the way. We appreciate and love the work of all builders, but when they're near your face for weeks on end,
it's not great. So yeah, I really would struggle to say what his tactical identity is.
Yeah.
Even his preferred system is difficult to answer.
Okay.
Yeah, Alex, because I remember I watched quite a bit of that Southampton side, and I was aware of his record for defensive solidity. To me, it just seemed as if instead of improving the actual caliber of the defense and the defensive unit, he just implemented this incredibly negative style of play, The point where even when attacking moves would develop, they would crawl forward at sort of glacial pace.
Yeah.
And so instead of actual, I mean, in my book, defensive solidity is an evaluation of a back six, whereas I always saw him as someone that created the conditions throughout his entire side, whereby there was never any possibility of a counter attack, or becoming exposed to a counter attack.
Yeah,
it was almost kind of. It was the cheating version of defensive solidity, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's some grounds to say that. I mean, he didn't like his team to counter-attack, that's for sure.
No, I mean in the sense that he wanted to make sure his team were never exposed to the counter-attack.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the odd thing about that Southampton side was that the creation of chances wasn't actually a massive problem. The conversion of chances was a horrific problem. And it persisted when Pellegrino took over as well. It was the same issue, defensively sound, a bit ponderous, certainly, but chances were created. No one scored them.
Same under Mark Hughes, though, right? I mean,
goals was one of the biggest. We should also point out that Les Reed has also lost his job for good reason. The recruitment was not good enough, and there's glaring issues with, particularly say if you look at central defence, and that's why I think Hasenhüttl's been playing three at the back. It's not because it's a system that he's completely familiar with or completely in favour of. It's because none of those centre backs are convincing, and Virgil van Dijk can mask the inadequacies of his colleagues for only so long. And obviously, he's been left, and it's now Yoshida, Stevens. Vestergaard looks like he could be okay. Bednarek played okay over the last week.
Bednarek is he's a really interesting player. I think he has the potential to be very talented, but again, positional issues, and you could see someone like Bednarek, and I watched recently. I watched his performance against Arsenal back again for a thing that I was looking at, and there were just too many times where he went wandering and went hunting for the ball when it wasn't there, and you kind of feel like a Van Dijk, for example, would have been shouting and saying, no, stay here, let the midfield do that. So yeah, there were recruitment issues with that Southampton side, but again, I think it's difficult to see beyond sort of keep it tight and don't expose ourselves quite what Puel was wanting to do. And that is quite different to how he played at Nice. And I think that, there is possibly as well that sense of a manager moving from Liga to the Premier League wanting to mitigate weakness rather than express strength, express creativity and attacking movement. Because it's better for a team's overall performance not to ship goals than it is to kind of tear forwards and get exposed.
I suppose from a Leicester perspective, what's probably frustrating is that you've kind of been a lot of investment in, well, not a lot of faith placed in sort of in attacking players. I think it's someone like Damari Gray who feels like he's been on the verge of becoming a really, really good player for 2 or 3 years now. So I've seen a lot of him at England on 21 level. He's a fantastic player. And you can imagine him becoming really destructive in the top half of the league. You brought in Maddison as well, and Tielemans has come in, and I think Ndidi, although a holding player, is an interesting player on the front foot too. So it's kind of like it's that sort of mismatch between what Puel is and what Leicester are trying to become, which I suppose, it probably underpins some of the kind of the frustration.
Okay.
Him.
Well, Puel is a thing of the past now, as far as Leicester is concerned, and the new manager, to my surprise, certainly, I can kind of understand it in terms of a seeking a manager who has a certain credibility, maybe,
aura.
An aura, recognizable, but it's certainly an odd one, isn't it, Seb?
I don't think it is, Joe. I think it's very logical. So the first thing to deal with Brendan Rodgers is Brendan Rodgers, the man, who he's never come across as, he does come across as arrogant. I think he's more just quite an odd person rather than an arrogant one. And obviously he's a figure of fun because he believes in this kind of positive reinforcement style of speaking. So he is prone to leaving the occasionally silly sounding soundbite on the front pages, unfortunately. But as a coach, you look at what he represents, which is a very good record with young players, a past which includes fine counter-attacking football, but also neat, attractive, possession-based football. And that's what Leicester are trying to become. And if you look at their transfer record over the past few years and the type of footballer that they've brought into the club, or even as recently as January, you don't bring in a Yuri Tielemans if your intention is to remain a purely counter-attacking side, a kind of in the Ranieri sense. That it's not going to be a long drink water ball over the top and a Mahrez Navardi and a breaking approach. It is they want to control the ball. And I think also, I look back on the Puel months, years, not years, but his time at the club. And I think if you look at the amount of errors in the side and the amount of mistakes which have led to the concession of goals or the dropping of points, Rodgers is someone who particularly young players in the past have reacted very well to and been emboldened by. And you could potentially have huge growth from that squad because it's full of really promising footballers. If you can harness all the good in Rodgers, and you can avoid the sort of the bad embodied by his final months at Liverpool, it could be an excellent appointment. It could be a brilliant one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I feel I must apologise again for. I feel like we're recording a podcast from inside of the Stomp musical. Just a little bit less rhythmic. Can
I have a bit of a shout at someone?
Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do, really. I mean,
I think this constitutes more than normal noise, personally.
Well, maybe, but we're in the middle of a podcast. And,
that's true.
But we could make it really entertaining by one of us going out and having a bit of a... It could branch out. If we took one of the cameras off its tripod and just followed that in the kind of reality
One
TV.
of the comments on last week's podcast was something like, "This is shit. It's just three posh boys sitting around talking
That's
about
right.
stuff. We mustn't encourage those beliefs by shouting at builders."
Can you imagine how much he hates that he's been bracketed with you and I?
I mean, I really
love that.
Just to be clear, I'm incredibly poor. Yeah? These two, it's a different story.
Joe was actually at school with both of us, all the way through from 7 to 18.
What, the School of Hard Knocks? Were you there too?
Exactly that. He's a fully paid up member of the Hyphen Club.
Someone on the was it a podcast? It might have been a video. Someone left a comment the other day saying the first bit was nice. First comment was very nice. Someone said, "Oh, love this guy's voice." I thought that's nice.
Yeah.
That's nice. And then someone replied, "Yeah, Eton alumni potentially."
Absolutely.
Disgusting.
Yeah.
It's disgusting. I mean, that's you, isn't it?
Yeah,
Didn't you go there?
I did indeed.
Didn't you go to some Eton rip-off?
No, I went to Eton's rivals,
Okay.
Winchester.
Well,
we perceive them
Let's
to be
stop
rivals,
discussing
maybe.
both of your privileges.
Yeah.
And
Because you're the one who brought it up.
He thinks that sort of if we do that, then by
It'll
association,
alienate people.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. What did I say about not all talking at the same time? Posh people cannot be corralled. Now shush. Alex,
Yeah.
talk to me about Brendan Rodgers, because I'm surprised by Seb. We didn't talk to Seb about this beforehand. I thought he'd say it was as weird as I thought it was. Tactically speaking, I mean, we get I understand the idea of wanting to shift. I understand the idea of wanting to shift, right? And I remember when, to a lesser degree, a recent example is when Southampton, going back to them again, employed Mark Hughes, or particularly when Stoke employed Mark Hughes, as an idea of moving away from the Tony Pulis era, moving into the possession-based game, slightly more attacking, blah, 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 you know. It just seems so odd with Leicester, I think, because they were so successful with that system, and particularly with the players that were uncovered, that it seems almost like the end of an era if they're to do that. How's it going to work?
Yeah, so I watched the Watford game, and obviously it's very, very difficult to base an assessment of what's going to happen on one game. It's not very difficult, it's impossible and also stupid. However, I'm going to do it a little bit. I agree in principle with everything that Seb has said in terms of there is a nucleus of players there, and particularly if you look at who scored kind of metrics for players and how they rate them, the top 6 for Leicester are all 25 years old or younger, and that's Pereira, Maddison and Didi, Maguire, Chilwell and Tielemans. That is a really, really exciting nucleus of players. Then you've got people like Damari Gray, you've got Harvey Barnes. So
Chowdhury, I put in. Chowdhury's really
Hamza
interesting.
Chowdhury could be really interesting. So there's definitely a group of players who I think they're not just talented, but they are young enough to impose a different style on. And I think this is crucial. You're not going to teach Wes Morgan to be a cultured striding forwards defender. Like that ship has sailed. Arguably, Johnny Evans, not so much either. But two of the three key cogs for that title-winning side have gone. So Drinkwater was kind of the quarterback supplying these fantastic long passes. He's no longer there. They don't need that now so much. Tielemans is much more about the angled slide rule along the ground pass, which, Vardy will benefit from, but he's a different style of player. Mahrez, those incisive runs, well, Maddison can do it a bit, Barnes can do it a bit, but they don't need to play that way so much now.
What about Kante? We're not including Kante?
Yeah, but I think Kante was crucial in that system because him winning the ball back was what allowed Leicester to then counter-attack. And if Leicester are going to shift across to a more possession-based style, Ndidi is a very capable defensive midfielder. They've also got Mendy, who can step into that role if required. But they don't need somebody who is quite so aggressive in hunting the ball if they're going to look to be holding onto it a lot more. I think what was interesting about the Watford game were three things to me. Firstly, the number of sloppy mistakes Leicester made. Little interchanges of passing that didn't come off, misplaced balls.
Is that potentially part of playing with a back three? For the
I think it was only the second time, and there certainly was a passage of play after about 20 minutes where they sort of tried to pass it out from the back, and it just went horrifically wrong. But they showed a willingness to try things, which was interesting. Their best attacking moments, to me, came from switch passes, where the ball would be moved very quickly from one flank to the other to one of the wing-backs, who would then pull it back across, all the way across to the other wing-back, who would then drill a low cross in. And Pereira and Chilwell combined really well a few times to do this. That is not classically Rodgers to me. So I think there will be a period of transition where this kind of direct style, which Leicester can play, will be gradually eased out. Brendan Rodgers is very associated with a 4-2-3-1, with the creation of overloads, using an inside forward who tucks in, overlapping fullbacks. In his first season at Celtic, Tierney pushed really, really, really high on the left. Lustig much less so, but this season he's had Toljan on loan from a Bundesliga club I can't remember, and they were hyper-aggressive fullbacks, almost playing as wingbacks. So, that's what he likes to do. There were aspects of what Leicester were seeking to do against Watford that kind of chimed with that, even using a three at the back. I think the other thing to say quickly on a tactical basis is that although we associate Vardy with a certain style of play, I think Vardy is a more intelligent footballer than people give him credit for. And I don't think that Vardy will be, isolated by a possession style of football. Rodgers had a lot of success using Dembele as a very, very quick, very aggressive forward at the tip of the possessional spear. So I think Vardy can adapt easily.
I mean, even thinking about teams such as Arsenal with players like Aubameyang, if they're on the back foot, you do see teams who like to play with the ball, who have line-breaking strikers, on the shoulder, running in behind. It does happen. Right?
It definitely happens.
I agree. I would extend the point about Vardy to say not only is he more intelligent than people give him credit for, but just generally, I think he's better than people give him credit for. Some of the goals that he scores are from angles that are unbelievable.
He's obviously a quality finisher. He's extremely quick. He's very, very hard-working. But I think what you also have with the particularly Maddison dropping into that 10 slot, Barnes moving up and down, almost a little bit like Deulofeu plays at Watford, kind of sort of a winger, sort of an attacking midfielder, sort of a striker. Vardy has the intelligence and the pace and also the stamina to keep making runs, to create gaps for those players to move in.
Yeah.
And if Leicester don't adopt that kind of slightly more possessional, slower build-up, which requires that interchange, you've always got an angle ball from Tielemans or a crossfield pass from Pereira, who is a class actor at right wing back, that's, Vardy's not going to suddenly forget how to play off the shoulder and be the one man running through one-on-one with the goalkeeper. Yeah. So, I think Leicester could be really, really well set. It will be a period of transition, though.
No. I was nodding in agreement. This is part of our communication issue.
Oh, I see.
I ignore the diktat about not speaking at the same time. So I'll lean back into my chair.
Okay. So in terms of the transition then, because there will be one we've discussed already, even from early examples of the game with Watford, there were some struggles, and of course we expect that Brendan Rodgers will try to transition the side over a period of time into a team that does things like plays up from the back, holds onto the ball more, a very different style of football to the one that we've come to associate with Leicester. In our experience of watching this happen, other Premier League teams, how long does this sort of process take? I mean, particularly within... The builders are shushing themselves.
Whilst dropping huge iron bars on the floor, yeah. So
it really is like a cartoon.
Yeah. Okay.
It's fun. Maybe I should stop mentioning it because there's a chance I can edit out the background noise. People might just wonder what on earth we're talking about. But
maybe you're just hearing things and there are no builders.
That could be it too. Yeah, it wouldn't be the first time. What was I even saying?
We're talking about how long it takes for a new ideology to take seed.
Yeah.
I don't think there's a definitive timeline, Joe. I think it depends on a few variables. Certainly, when you add in things like trying to play out from the back, generally that complicates matters. Mm-hmm. We saw Arsenal really struggle with it at the beginning, even with Petr Cech and the sort of the very famous issues he's had.
Manchester United under Louis van Gaal trying to play out from the back, and it just being excruciating.
It never stopped. I mean, there was never a tipping point with that. So you don't know. I think for Rodgers. A few things. I mean, if you're going to play that way, are you going to rebuild your defense? Alex spoke earlier about Wes Morgan never potentially evolving to become a kind of a great striding Beckenbauer of a centre half. That's not going to happen. Maybe Wes Morgan is also reaching the end anyway.
Well, he's quite old.
Exactly, and he's nothing he does now is going to tarnish his legacy. He is a Leicester immortal, quite rightly. I wonder whether also there needs to be a general overhaul of some of the stranger parts in this squad. What are you doing with someone like Kelechi Iheanacho, for instance, who I really liked as a young player, and I thought when Leicester signed him, that's a fantastic bit of business. Not so much. It hasn't really worked. So what do you do with an asset that's declining in value but still has a value? So weird little decisions like that. I don't know. I mean, I think. I mean, if you look at Pochettino at Spurs, that took a good 6 months before his ideas became accepted by the fans, but also manifested in performance. Klopp at Liverpool is another example. I mean, people may pretend otherwise now, but the first season there wasn't pretty. There were signs of what was to come, but certainly by season 2 and season 3, they had become definitively his team in a way which previously they weren't. They were just a kind of hodgepodge of what had happened before. Mistakes in the transfer market, ill-suited players doing a kind of imitation of the players they actually needed to be to work under him. So it's going to depend on what Leicester do in the market, how they finish the season, how the players respond to Brendan Rodgers the person, because this process is always defined by the kind of the human connections. Sometimes Rodgers has worked very well with young players. Sometimes he hasn't had a connection with older players, like most famously, and I suppose anomalously, Mario Balotelli and him did not have a spectacular relationship. Christian Benteke and him, despite him being a kind of a Rodgers sponsor signing, that didn't work either. So he falls out with some players. He reacts very well with others. Let's see how the kind of the human dynamics within the dressing room work first.
A quick note on that, because we've already discussed the idea of Jamie Vardy being very influential at Leicester City. If you were Brendan Rodgers, let's just imagine that for a moment. What do you do with Jamie Vardy? I mean, presumably you get him on side or you get rid of him, right?
Yeah, but absolutely. But then I think it's an easier decision than that, Jay, because Jamie Vardy is still a huge asset. Like, he is 32. A lot of his game relies on pace, and there is an endpoint there. But at the moment, there's not a... Jamie Vardy isn't going to be done a favour by Brendan Rodgers by starting him. He is still the best centre-forward at the club by a long way, and also the only centre-forward at the club who's capable of playing in that way. So as long as Jamie Vardy is being picked and scoring goals, Jamie Vardy will be happy, I'd have thought.
It was seeded all over the Sunday papers from Rodgers that Vardy will be crucial to everything I do at Leicester.
I see.
Of course.
Okay. So the PR war has already begun in that regard. And
look at you reading the Sunday papers.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Some hilarious visuals attached to that. Just yeah. But
there is an extent to which if you get a player on side like that, the talismanic effect of Troy Deeney at Watford, for example, not just a great player who does his role very, very capably, but also a kind of a driving force. And if Rodgers is as sensible and astute at man management as he has the reputation of being, then it'll be very much going to Vardy and saying, you are my point man for this transition. You and Kasper Schmeichel particularly, you understand the club in a way that I don't. You've seen it through. You
make me happy when times are grey.
Tragedy, etc.
Mm-hmm.
You are going to be the guys that spearhead this transition and help me guide all of these young players through what is not just a kind of a leadership transition, but also a tactical one. I noticed actually that Leicester signed, and I'm never ever going to pronounce this guy's name correctly, Kaglar Soyuncu, who's a Turkish centre-back who was at Freiburg, and he actually is the sort of centre-back that will be able to play in that system. So I think that's an astute Leicester signing that had kind of passed me by, actually.
Okay.
I looked at him in the summer for something, and he was really quite impressive. He's a bit hot-headed, but he could be very, very good. So that evolution, and I'm not saying that Leicester were thinking about this sort of thing way back, but they've started to get their playing squad ducks in a row ahead of this transition, which I think is quite intelligent.
They probably were thinking about that a long way. I mean, they've got John Rudkin is still the sporting director there, and I think he's been at the club since 2003, 2004. He came in as I think head of the academy, and he's stayed there. He's kind of progressed up the ladder, and he's been sort of a constant for a decade and a half there. So there is a lot of continuity in their recruiting system.
Sorry. The builders are now hoovering. Right. Okay. Sorry, I'm really thrown off. Does someone want to tell me about Brendan Rodgers at Celtic quickly? We've touched on it, but we haven't really discussed it very much.
Maybe the interesting thing there is maybe the reaction of the Celtic fans to Brendan Rodgers leaving, and it's kind of this issue that never goes away between this kind of almost this contradiction between. Yes, Celtic being a very big club historically and with an enormous fan base and a big ground and very successful, but also the lure of a upper mid-table Premier League side.
The reaction is what?
So after Brendan Rodgers left, the very next game, the Celtic fans unveiled a banner saying, I can't remember the specific wording, but basically it included the word fraud and... Well, you got
that would explain.
I felt it was harsh.
That would explain the numerous comments in the
user
questions regarding
it's very
Tifo.
So essentially, when Rodgers came to the club, he said, I grew up in a Celtic supporting family. It's a dream. I'm going to be here to, win the 10 titles in a row, etc., etc. And there's a sense that as soon as somebody showed him a bit of ankle, he was out the door straight away without blinking. And David Walsh's piece in the Sunday Times said, he didn't even say goodbye to people when he left. I don't know whether that's true or not, but I think there's a sense that I think people are naive to expect enormous amounts of loyalty in football nowadays. And I think, if you're a Premier League side and he has been a Premier League manager, when that opportunity comes up again, he would obviously take it. I think the issue is what he said when he took the Celtic job gave the impression that he would not have his head turned by anybody, which is possibly naive on his part. And it's very difficult to gauge whether he believed all of that at the time that he said it, or he was saying it to get on side with the fans. Who knows? But if you're Brendan Rodgers, this move uncontrovertibly makes sense.
I wonder. I mean, if Brendan Rodgers turns up at your football club, there's an expectation right from day one that he is going to say things. He is going to say things which perhaps don't bear scrutiny. So he comes in and he talks about, this being I think he referred to the job as being the ultimate job, and it just being that he could not possibly be any happier anywhere else. But then at the same time, this stuff works both ways. If Brendan Rodgers has a bad 6 months, they kick him out the door. It doesn't matter whether he was a fan. It doesn't matter what his familial allegiances were and what he inherited from his father. And also, what beyond 3 years, what is the treble? I understand that and the appeal of that. What is Brendan Rodgers' motivation for remaining at Celtic beyond this place? Don't get me wrong. If I'm a Celtic fan and he walks out on me, I'm also having a mighty sulk on social media about it. I'm probably also holding up banners in my stadium. But rationally, what is he, the individual, the guy with the CV, the guy that's trying to plot his career through the market? What is he gaining by remaining in Scotland? 3 years is a pretty good return on him. He's left the club in a very good condition. It's also worth noting, and this might be something worth revisiting in a few months' time, that by all accounts, Leicester would have waited for him until the summer, at which point the compensation due would have been far less. I think Celtic have made something around like £6-7 million out of him being bought out of his contract. So I wonder if there hasn't been a kind of a mutual decision somewhere that, right, this is the time for you to go. So maybe, as much respect as I have for David Walsh and his writing, maybe it's a case of let's see what the Celtic angle on this was. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, Celtic have done very well out of this. They're in position to, win all the things they were going to win previously. They won over the weekend under Neil Lennon. Fantastic. So I'm not sure whether we have full perspective on this yet.
And I think it's important for Rodgers because, he's 46, but this is his 6th proper club managed now, Leicester, after his work at Chelsea in the academy. And, Liverpool reached a kind of stylistic high point, but then fell away. And the SPL a job at Celtic is a weird job to take because obviously you're going to achieve success in terms of trophies because Celtic are so financially dominant in that league that it would be perverse to assume otherwise. In the same way that Champions League football aside, winning domestic competitions with PSG doesn't really count for very much because obviously you're going to do it. So, he's kind of adding to his CV in terms of time and in terms of things won and a certain style. But it's also going to be taken with a pinch of salt because it's being achieved in a league where everything is geared to that success occurring. So I think he now sees an opportunity crucially to mould a very talented young squad to get them playing a certain kind of way, but in the league where, he could be a professional football manager for another 20 years, very conceivably.
There's a couple of things at work here. I think the way he left English football has instructed this because rather unfairly, he left as a standing joke. I mean, he is unreasonably blamed for Liverpool's failure to win that title in 2014. And then obviously his reputation was damaged by the aftermath of the sale of Luis Suarez and the nonsense that went on at Liverpool then and the collapse. The thing I liken it to actually in a kind of abstract way is Guardiola moving to Bayern Munich. Not because they have a similar stature, but because he went into a club where they already had all the dominance that Alex spoke of. But he reinvented the way they played. So sort of the Celtic that won under Brendan Rodgers was stylistically very different from what had come before. The trouble for him is that English football being as insular as it is and as arrogant as it is, no one cares. Yeah. And that's not fair. But that is unfortunately the way the vast majority of the English footballing public think. They're not interested. They don't. They see Celtic's name at the top of the league, at the top of the SPL in the Sunday paper, and they think, okay.
I think to a degree, but I also think that it's a lot easier to change the style and to develop players and play very attractive football when the team that's finishing second is paying a couple of grand a week to its most prized asset. And I think, yes, I'd be the first to agree that English football is insular and arrogant and looks down on anything that's not English football. At the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that the, not criticisms of Rodgers, but the caveats around his performance at Celtic aren't also merited. And, that's why the Champions League becomes the barometers for these sorts of clubs. And to be fair, it'll be a barometer for Man City as much as it is for Celtic, as much as it is for PSG, because league football will put up so many challenges. But when you get to a certain point, whether it's in disparity of ability, disparity of finances, disparity of playing staff, it's against the other really, really great teams that have similar advantages that you actually get tested. And Rodgers didn't develop in Europe.
Oh no, I'd agree, and I think that's the other Guardiola parallel. It's kind of for everything he did in the Bundesliga, he showed a regression in Champions League football, or at least Champions League. The standard of the Champions League elite evolved quicker than he did with Bayern, which is that's wandering way off topic. And Joe had a hand up. So
well, I'm going to move us on because we're running over a little bit, which also means we're going to skim over the financial fair play thing we were talking. Only because I would have dropped it, but we mentioned it earlier, right? Tell me if I'm wrong or not, Seb. And I'm going to read from my computer so to attempt not to be wrong from the notes that I took earlier. This was, God, I didn't even write down the date, but it was 2012, I believe. So they were still in the Championship. The issue at the time was that Leicester violated the financial fair play rules, which they, I think a year ago, were fined about £3 million for.
3.1 million. Reached a settlement in February 2018.
Okay, right. So that's all fine. But the issue that they had at the time was certainly the chairman and owners of other clubs were complaining about at the time was that the way in which they reduced what their overall losses that season were from over 30 million to 21 million, which was the official figure for which they were sanctioned the fine, right? Was quite unusual. And it's quite funny as well. So the club, they sold the naming rights to the stadium and the shirt sponsorship, which previously were owned by King Power, to a global marketing company called Tristella, I believe they're called.
Run by the son of Dave Richards, who used to be the chief executive of the Premier League.
Yeah. Who then pretty quickly sold those rights and the sponsorship rights back to King Power for £11 million more than they were worth. Just before that they bought them.
Yeah.
Incidentally, it's worth pointing out that it's very difficult to get any naming rights for a stadium in the Championship, and I think the average annual shirt sponsorship is less than £1 million. So the idea of a club earning at the time, so the idea of a club at the time earning 15 million for those things, that's quite extraordinary, isn't it? And I mean, it certainly helped them get promoted.
Look, we're not here to point fingers, because I don't think
I love stirring.
I think everyone has a few skeletons in their closet with FFP, and
yeah, of course.
I think what's interesting.
We should point it out, though.
We should point it. We can't just pretend it didn't
obviously,
happen.
this is worth saying, right? But obviously, the story of the club's owner is tragic and sad. It is obviously very sad, right? But it doesn't mean that we don't point out that happened.
No, of course, no. We're not trying to rake anything up. And by all accounts, the matter is closed as of a year ago.
We've done it with every other club.
We have done it with every other club. You can go back to the pods and check. I think what interests me about this is kind of David Conn did a series of investigative articles from about 2016 onwards.
The Guardian journalist,
David Conn, and he dug into Trey Stella, which is.
Sorry for those listening.
Maybe people caught that on the camera, but my microphone just fell.
My favourite thing about that as well is for people who are listening. What happened is I've rigged up a device, a weighted device to hold up Seb's
microphone.
No, it's not the microphone. It's the wind blower. The wind. The thing you put in. Why am I blanking on the name, Alex?
I don't know.
The thing.
Well, they can see it.
People listening can't see it.
Wind guard.
Okay.
A wind guard, sort of a wind guard.
Guard.
Right? So I've rigged up a weight device which stopped it from falling. However, it did just fall. And then the best bit was that instead of speaking into the microphone, Seb continued to speak into the wind guard, which was no longer in front of the microphone.
And now I can't rebalance it.
How did I even do that?
How did you do that?
Push it all the way into the middle. This is great podcasting. No, not the thing. Push the weight all the way as far as it will. There you go. Look at that. Just simple physics.
So
FFP.
Trace Stellar, David Conn dug into it, and it's a company without a website, without a functioning office,
No phone number.
Apparently
they don't need it.
They don't need it because their reputation is good enough, which may be true. It's just a very interesting story. I think we're not here to pass judgment or to make assumptions or accusations. It's another example of sometimes how opaque football can be.
Mm-hmm.
And it's part of Leicester's backstory. They have reached a settlement with the Football League, and they've paid their fine and they've moved on. And actually, at the time, they say that rather than breaking the rules, this was an issue which amounted to a difference in interpretation of the rules. Whether you want to, I have no comment to make about that. I just that's the case as it was.
I interpret that there is a loophole here.
I think we exist in a post-Der Spiegel world where you have this stuff which is a bit knick-knacky in comparison to other things which are going on above the food chain. So this is really just interesting rather than kind of, I wouldn't say that it's a cause of outrage.
Yeah. Anyway, what is success for Leicester now? This is where we've come to at the end of the podcast. We'll answer some podcast questions in a moment. But what interested me, and in fact, I'll bring up some of the questions now. Because they feed into this theme, right? What is success for Leicester now? Many of the comments suggest that because of the position that Leicester are currently in, that they are not currently successful, or that things are going terribly wrong, or that I can't talk because I'm looking at Seb. What am I saying? This is an awful podcast. I'm saying that many people believe that Leicester are currently underperforming, but presumably partly because they won the league in such extraordinarily overperforming fashion 3 years ago. To be mid-table with Leicester, to have the sorts of the squad that they have, to have the money available that they have, that's not really underperforming, is it?
No, it's not.
It's a question of perception.
Underperforming, and it's exactly the sort of thing that we were talking about with Watford in the last podcast, and sorry, not the last, but the podcast before, and also Everton. Leicester are in a position where they can start to develop a style. They can start to develop a coterie of younger players, either who will be the foundation of the team for the next 5 years and see them to whatever their version of success is, or be turned for significant profits and reinvested. There is a good track record here of developing either from the academy or signing young and then developing players, particularly English players.
Well, let's put a value on it then, right? What is success for them now? What would in your eyes be a successful season for Leicester?
I think there's a group of 3 or 4 teams currently, and I would include Watford, Wolves, probably Leicester, Everton, that sort of coterie, who will be scrapping out for the position beneath the top 6, and to be the head of that pack is probably success, and I would chuck a cup competition in there as well.
Kind of a deeper, more philosophical question here at work, in that how do you deal with, once you've pushed through the wardrobe and you've walked around a little bit in Narnia, how do you deal with coming back through? Because that's what it is. It's a sort of, Leicester won a Premier League title as really part of a miracle. Now, once that's finished and you are back to kind of the humdrum of regular life, where all the old sort of glass ceiling truisms exist and the kind of the restrictions placed on you by the wealth higher up the division, like how do you settle back into kind of normal rational fandom? It's very difficult. I think it's a question which, depending on which Leicester fan you speak to, it has a different answer. And so it will always depend on what stage of that kind of that I suppose reintegrate when these fans return to their equilibrium of being, this is what we are, that has happened, it's been wonderful, but it's now in the past. I think it's a very difficult thing because there aren't any precedents for it, really. You can look back. Blackburn wasn't a miracle. Blackburn spent a lot of money to win their title. So there's no real comparable. I mean, even things like Wimbledon winning the FA Cup is not even vaguely similar, really.
Leicester spent a fair amount of money.
They did,
but they only became a Premier League side at the end of they got promoted at the end of the 13-14 season.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the way to look at it is also not to say Leicester spent a lot of money in that short period. It's a Leicester beat out competition from teams who had spent the previous decade spending very, very heavily, season in, season out, twice a year.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way, not to just look at figures that, 12-month figures or anything like that.
Leicester are comparable in some ways to what Wolves have done. Wolves have probably spent more and achieved it a little bit quicker.
Mm-hmm.
But I would also say that we're not going to be looking at a situation in 3 years' time where Wolves have lifted the title.
No.
And if they have done that, which won't happen, they will have done it by spending huge amounts of money in a way that Leicester didn't actually do. I mean, the foundation of that Leicester
they spent
title,
£100 million over a couple of years.
Right,
But that deserves its context.
That deserves its context, and also the key players of the title win were none of them expensive signings.
Yeah, that's a key point.
So but I just think
it was a fairy tale, guys.
It was a complete.
I'm a Tottenham fan. It wasn't a fairy tale.
It was a complete anomaly, and
it was
that's
devastating.
reflected in everything that's been said about it and written about it, and what was happening at the time.
We've got about 8 minutes to answer some questions before the builders really start to do some drilling at midday. The first one I'm going to throw to you guys. I like this question. Sam Hardy. Were Leicester wrong to sack Ranieri so soon after winning the league? Did he deserve more respect for his achievements? The second part of the question.
I think it's a really hard question to answer because it's just, this is the game. It doesn't. Ultimately, what Leicester had to guard against was the threat of relegation. And I think what's happened at Fulham in the last week is it kind of helps to provide some context here too, is that Ranieri has some limitations. And Alex spoke earlier about what role he played in that championship win. It was a great success for him in the sense that he knew his place and that he knew what to facilitate. But when, again, they came back through the wardrobe, then you saw sort of the issues which have blighted his career, had blighted his career all the way up until that point. So it was sad. It was really sad, but it was understandable.
Okay, Alex. Will Emmett asks, has Leicester City's squad improved since winning the title? That's a really tough one.
I think it has, in the sense that they've lost a player that was key to the style but has gone on to do nothing in Drinkwater.
Mm-hmm.
They've lost two exceptionally talented, arguably top 20 in the Premier League players. But they have reinvested that money really astutely.
Mm-hmm.
They have bought players and developed players who are very, very good. And if you were looking at the next 5 years, Leicester have got some fantastic younger players in that mix.
Yeah.
So overall as a squad, I think they probably have improved despite losing.
In a moment, I'm going to ask you who could replace an ageing Jamie Vardy. But first, I'm going to ask Seb. Jungwoo Kim asks, does Leicester have a chance of challenging in the Champions League or the Europa League in the near future, or are they likely to be stuck in mid-table?
Europa League, possibly. Brendan Rodgers.
What's the situation with the Europa League at the moment, though, in terms of finishing positions in the Premier League? Because I feel like that changes all the time.
In the future, it's going to be complicated by Europa League 2, which I feel like that needs a little bit more branding. So depending on first of all, it depends on each season who wins the league and League Cup and the FA Cup.
I love that idea. Here's a second of a competition that non-competing teams don't care about.
Europa League 2.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing is, it's a critical revenue source for a lot of teams.
That's why I specified non-competing teams.
Yeah, okay.
I think it's very important.
Leicester are more than capable of being competitive in the Europa League, Europa League 1. Depending on what happens over the next 18 months, what's invested, what kind of synergy there is between them and their first team squad and Brendan Rodgers. Champions League, probably not. I think the Champions League, I don't see them qualifying for the Champions League. That isn't to say that they're going to finish 10th each season. I think they have an excellent chance of competing with that in that small sort of group of clubs with Wolves and hopefully Everton at some point again.
Okay.
And Watford. So they'll be I think their great aim is to be the vanguard of that little group.
Okay. The question about Jamie Vardy, Alex, comes from Vincent Yan, who I believe is the Dutch owner of Cardiff. He also asks, will Iheanacho ever be good enough? So I suppose that's a secondary to Alex. Have you got any thoughts on who could replace an aging Jamie Vardy?
No.
Okay, fine. Seb, will Iheanacho ever be good enough? You mentioned him before, which is why I sent this to you.
I think he'll be a good player, but I don't think he'll be a good one for Leicester.
Okay.
How about that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Cop out, but
He's a really odd player in that
I don't think he's a forward. I think he's sort of somewhere between a 9 and a 10. I don't think
it's I agree, and there's the kind of the Okazaki thing going on there. That there's this sort of hybrid link. I think he'd do really well in the Bundesliga.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a two-part question.
That's not an insult, by the way.
No. A two-part question from Darren Kennedy. The first is who could Leicester recruit in the summer? The second is it's more of a statement really, and followed up by a question from Darren. I believe Rodgers' arrival will be very positive for the likes of Maddison and Gray. Mm-hmm. Do you believe that they're far off regular England call-ups?
So part one, objective A is Tielemans. Something strange about him is that I'm a little suspicious because when he became available, his best option was Leicester. I mean, with all due respect, sort of a couple of years ago, he was the kind of player that should have alerted almost any side in Europe, and yet I know Tottenham had an option on him, and they didn't. They decided not an option, but they decided against signing him. So it suggests there's a red flag somewhere. I suppose the problem for Leicester now is that if he plays very, very well, that interest is going to re-emerge and they're going to face some serious competition. Hopefully,
he is playing really well.
He is, but it's early. I mean, I saw him at Wembley against Spurs and he was great. He had a good game yesterday. Played a very nice ball for Vardy's goal. But let's wait and see on that one. I think I'd want to see another centre half come in there, another full-time option to full-time partner for Harry Maguire, someone who also makes the idea of a back three more. Not competent, but someone that can, play out from the back. Maddison and Gray, I don't know. I mean, I Maddison, yes, he'll be given a chance because he's thought of extremely highly by almost everyone at the FA. Mm-hmm. Demarai Gray was a veteran of Eddie Boothroyd's England under-21 sides and very highly thought of. Whether unfortunately, there's a lot of alternatives in his position. I mean, not just Raheem Sterling and Marcus Rashford, but also now players like Jadon Sancho. Yeah. So he faces a bit of a tough task to get to the head of that list. But I think he's a very, very fine player at the moment. The only thing that should really matter is become the sort of the 10 goal a season player he can obviously be because he's very, very talented. So okay, and Rodgers should be good for him.
Flicking through the questions, there are many examples of the word fraud being used. Also, rat. I'd hate to go back to the snake gate of a couple of weeks ago. What is a rat? What is a snake? So let's move on to Jesse Pays. How often will Brendan Rodgers say hard work, character, intensity, and other manager cliches?
Outstanding.
That's a bit everywhere. Outstanding. Before the season begins, I suppose that's a fun drinking game for people. Do you enjoy that?
Well, not one. I mean, it could kill you, given how many times it
probably would kill you. Not a fun drinking game. A deadly drinking game. Chris Hughes says, is Brendan Rodgers' move a step up, down, or sideways? And what are your reactions to Chris Sutton's comments that the Celtic reserves are a bigger team than Leicester?
I think
Chris Sutton's an idiot.
With all due respect, I think Chris Sutton wanted some attention for that.
And he's got it.
I think he speaks a lot of sense sometimes, but there's sort of 25% of the time where he falls into that kind of Robbie Savage trap of saying stuff in big capital letters. And, what was the first part of that question? My microphone has fallen down again.
Is it a step up, down, or sideways?
Oh, we've covered this. So I can make the argument either way. I understand why he's done it. Let's just put it that way. I don't want to upset any Celtic fans, really.
Okay, fair enough.
I think it's sideways in the sense that there's not Champions League football or the possibility of Champions League football in the same way that there is for Celtic.
Yeah.
But the Premier League is a bigger league.
Okay. All right, well, given that Seb's microphone...
I'm now holding it up manually.
Hey, listen, sometimes this job is hard, yeah? I know you just get to waltz in here and then leave whenever you want and leave me to do all the hard work, but...
He's done this deliberately. He's rigged it up to create a little challenge for me. It's like some shit version of Home Alone, isn't it?
Right. Okay. Well, listen. Thank you, Seb. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Joe.
Alex, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I was just thinking actually that we moved from Watford to Everton to Leicester with quite slick connections throughout. I wonder if we can think off the top of our heads of a connection that we could move to next week's team.
Southampton.
Yeah. Southampton, Wolves. Fulham.
Yes.
I think they're all quite interesting at the moment.
Southampton would be good with Hasenhüttl. We haven't really done that too much,
Very
have we?
encouraging performance against Arsenal, even if we didn't get.
And I am going to see them on Saturday as well, so that would work quite well.
Oh, it looks perfect, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's almost like
It's almost like we planned it.
these teams play each other regularly, and
It's almost like we have a
a
WhatsApp group dedicated to this podcast now.
a new one.
WhatsApp group.
Okay, thank you very much for listening. A quick shout for anyone who would like to become a Tifo Football YouTube channel member. You can click the join button below the videos over here somewhere and pay a sum of money once per month, which depends on where you live, directly to our bank account for our use to buy frivolous things that we don't need. But what that does give you access to is Alex once a week. Although not this week, sorry, because we're busy. I'm so good at this.
That is the shittest sales pitch ever. You can get something that is of questionable value anyway, and you actually can't get it all the time.
It's not of questionable value, because the value is this. You ask him to examine any kind of tactical question, team, player, manager, and he will spend about 14 minutes stood in front of a wall just over there, drawing little pictures for you and singing some songs. So that's it. Do give us all of your money. Thank you, and hope you tune in next week for what will probably be a podcast about Southampton. Goodbye.